The last train out of Dust Creek left at 7:42 in the evening. Selene Mercer knew this because she had watched it go. She stood on the platform with her suitcase pressed against her leg and her coat pulled tight across her chest, watching the rear lantern of the departing train shrink into the black desert horizon until it disappeared entirely. The sound faded slowly, the rhythmic clank of iron wheels on old track, and then there was nothing left but wind and the distant creak of a weather vane spinning on top of the station roof. She didn't cry. She had stopped doing that somewhere around the third or fourth time life had taken something from her without asking. What she felt instead was a familiar settling, the quiet collapse of hope into something denser and heavier that had no proper name, a kind of internal rearranging, the way a person shifts their weight when they realize the chair they're sitting in is broken and there's no other chair in the room. Selene picked up her suitcase and walked inside the station. The building was barely worth the name, one large room with a plank floor that had warped in the summer heat and never quite recovered. 3 wooden benches along the walls, each one worn smooth by decades of travelers who all had somewhere to be. A potbelly stove in the corner that hadn't been lit yet, though the October air outside had already turned cold enough to ache. A ticket window, closed and dark, with a handwritten notice taped to the glass that read, "Next service, 6:05 a.m." That was more than 10 hours away. Selene set her suitcase down beside the nearest bench and sat. The wood creaked under her. A lantern burned low on the counter near the window, throwing just enough light to see by. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the floor. She was 26 years old. She had traveled 400 miles. And the family she'd come to work for, the Aldermans, a couple who had placed a notice in the Eastern papers for a domestic hand with experience in cooking and child-minding, had opened their door, looked her up and down for approximately 4 seconds, and then told her the position had already been filled. "When?" Selene had asked. She hadn't meant to sound sharp. It came out sharp anyway. Mrs. Alderman, a thin woman with a mouth built for disapproval, had glanced past Selene's shoulder rather than at her face. "Recently," she said. "We sent a letter." "I didn't receive a letter." "Well," Mrs. Alderman's chin lifted slightly. "These things happen." And the door had closed. Not slammed. That would have at least been honest. It closed the way polite rejections always close, slowly, deliberately, with a soft and final click that somehow felt louder than any slam. Selene had stood on the alderman's porch for a moment, holding her suitcase, listening to the sound of voices resuming inside. A child laughing, the clink of dinnerware, life continuing without her, as it so often did. She had turned and walked back toward town. She'd arrived at the station with 12 minutes to spare before the last train. 12 minutes to decide whether to spend her last few coins on a ticket back east and return to a city where she had no work, no family, and no real prospects, or to stay and see if Dust Creek had anything better to offer than its name suggested. She had stood at the ticket window. She had not bought a ticket. The train had left without her. Now she sat in the empty station and tried to think clearly, which was difficult when her stomach had been empty since noon and the cold was beginning to seep through the walls. She had $7.40. Enough for a room somewhere, if she was careful. Enough for a few days of food, if she ate like someone trying to disappear. After that, she didn't know. She would have to find work quickly. Something, anything. Dust Creek was small, but small towns still needed hands. Laundry, cooking, maybe a shop owner looking for help. "You've done harder things," she told herself. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she said it anyway. She must have drifted for a while because the sound of the door opening startled her badly enough that she stood up before she was fully awake and knocked her suitcase off the bench. It hit the floor with a clatter. 2 small figures burst through the door ahead of a cold gust of wind. Girls, twins by the look of them, 8 or 9 years old, both wearing coats that were slightly too big and hats that were slightly too small, which gave them the appearance of children who had dressed themselves in a hurry. Which, Selene would later learn, they had. They stopped when they saw her. The taller one by about half an inch, dark-haired, serious-eyed, stared at Selene with the unblinking assessment that children are capable of when they haven't yet learned it's rude to stare. The other one, slightly rounder in the face and quicker to smile, looked at the fallen suitcase and then back at Selene. "Sorry," said the smiling one. "We didn't know anyone was in here." "It's all right," Selene said. She crouched and picked up the suitcase, checked the latch, still holding. "I didn't hear you coming." "We weren't trying to be quiet," said the serious one. "Ivy," said the smiling one, in the tone of someone who had delivered that single-word correction many times before. "What?" "I'm just saying we weren't." The smiling one looked back at Selene. "I'm June. That's Ivy. We're looking for our father." "Is he usually in train stations?" June thought about this seriously. "Not usually, but he said he was coming to check on something in town, and he takes a long time sometimes, and we got worried." "We weren't worried," Ivy said. "You asked me every 5 minutes if we should go look for him. That's not worried. That's just keeping track." Selene almost smiled. Almost. "I haven't seen anyone else come through tonight." "He might have come before you got here," June said. She was looking at Selene with the kind of open curiosity that has no meanness in it. The look of a child who is interested in a person the way she might be interested in an interesting rock or an unusual bird. Not judging, just looking. Selene was not accustomed to being looked at without judgment. It made her oddly uncomfortable. The door opened again. This time it was slower and heavier, and the man who came through it had to duck slightly under the frame. He straightened up inside the station and pushed the door shut behind him against the wind, and then he looked at his daughters, and then, with a pause that was not exactly long but was not exactly short either, at Selene. He was somewhere in his early 30s. Tall, not just tall the way people sometimes say someone is tall, but actually tall, with the kind of frame that came from years of physical work rather than intention. Dark hair, grown out past what careful men kept it, pushed back from his forehead. A jaw that needed a razor and hadn't gotten one recently. His coat was good quality and old, and the boots were the kind that had been resoled at least once. He did not look like a man who spent much time thinking about how he appeared. He looked like a man who spent most of his time thinking about other things. "Girls," he said. His voice was low and carried well, the kind of voice that didn't need volume. "I told you to wait at the general store." "You said you'd be 20 minutes, Ivy said. "I was 35, June added helpfully. I counted. Something moved in this man's expression. Not quite exasperation, not quite amusement. The particular expression of a parent who knows they are outnumbered and have accepted it. His gaze moved back to Selene. He didn't ask any questions, which was already different from most people. He just looked. The way someone looks when they are actually trying to understand something rather than confirm what they already think. "You're not from here," he said. Not accusatory, just observational. "No. Train?" "I arrived on the 4 o'clock. The last one already left." A beat. "Where are you headed?" Selene looked at him steadily. "I was headed here." He didn't react to that the way people usually reacted, with the slight pullback, the quick reassessment. He just nodded once, like she'd said something practical. "The Aldermans," he said. Not a question. Selene's chin lifted slightly. "You know them." "I know everyone. Small town." He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck. "I also know they filled that position 3 weeks ago when Margaret Hale's daughter came back from Abilene. Someone should have written." "They claim they did." His expression said what he thought of that without him having to say it out loud. "Caleb Thorne," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, but not the kind of firm that's trying to prove something. "Selene Mercer." "Miss Mercer." He glanced at the suitcase, then at the closed ticket window, then back at her. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" "I'm working on it." The twins were watching this exchange with the attentiveness of children at a theater. "There's no hotel in Dust Creek," Caleb said. "There's a boarding house on Maple Street run by a woman named Clara Briggs. She might have a room, but she goes to bed at 8 and doesn't appreciate being knocked on after." Selene glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:23. "Wonderful," she said quietly. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out anyway. Caleb Thorne was quiet for a moment. He looked at his daughters. Some kind of communication happened that Selene couldn't quite read. June's eyes got wide and bright. Ivy's narrowed slightly in thought. And Caleb looked at the ceiling for a moment as if consulting something located just above the station roof. Then he looked back at Selene. "My girls need someone like you," he said. She stared at him. "I don't know you," she said carefully. "You don't know me." "No." He didn't seem troubled by this. But I know June and Ivy haven't laughed at anything in about the time since their aunt left 6 months ago. And I know that in the 2 minutes since you've been talking with them, June has laughed twice and Ivy almost did. Selene looked at the girls. June was beaming. Ivy was doing the thing where you compress your lips very hard to prevent a smile, which is itself a form of smiling. She looked back at Caleb Thorne. You're offering a stranger a job because your daughter's almost smiled. I'm offering a stranger a warm place to sleep tonight and a conversation tomorrow morning about whether there's something more lasting we can work out. He held her gaze. That's all. Take it or leave it. It should have sounded reckless. Maybe it was reckless. But Selene had spent enough time around reckless men to know the difference between recklessness that was selfish and recklessness that was something else, something less comfortable to name. The kind that came from a person who was used to making decisions quickly because the alternative was things getting worse. She looked at her suitcase. She looked at the clock. She looked at June, who was attempting not to appear as though her entire future happiness depended on the answer to an unasked question and failing completely. One night, Selene said, the ride out to the ranch took 40 minutes by wagon through country that was flat for a while and then abruptly wasn't. Rolling hills cutting up from the plain, covered in dry grass that moved in the wind like something breathing. The sky out here was enormous. Even at night, with the moon only a quarter full, Selene could feel the size of it pressing down. She sat in the wagon bed with the girls on either side of her, which had been June's arrangement and which Ivy had agreed to with the particular dignity of someone who was agreeing for strategic reasons of her own. Caleb drove without talking, which Selene appreciated. People who felt the need to fill silence always exhausted her. Do you know how to braid hair? June asked. June, Ivy said. What? It's a real question. It's the third question you've asked her in 2 minutes. So she just met us. June considered this, then looked at Selene. Is it too many questions? It's fine, Selene said. Yes, I know how to braid hair. June looked at Ivy with the satisfaction of someone who has made an excellent discovery and intends to remember it. Ivy looked out at the dark hills. Do you like horses? Ivy asked, without looking back. I grew up with them. A pause. Ivy glanced back. What kind? Mixed. My uncle had a small breeding operation. Nothing impressive. What happened to it? He died. Ivy was quiet. I'm sorry. It was a while ago. Does it still hurt? June asked. She asked it the way children ask things that adults have learned to leave alone, with genuine curiosity and no protective armor around the question at all. Selene thought about lying, the way adults do. Then she thought about what the lie would accomplish. Sometimes, she said. June nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she already suspected about how the world worked. The wagon turned off the main road and began the last stretch toward the ranch. Selene saw the house first, a long, low structure with light in 2 of the windows, wider than it was tall, built to last rather than impress. Then the barns behind it, large dark shapes against the darker sky. Fencing that went further than she could see. It was a serious piece of land. She hadn't expected that, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected instead. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop by the house and climbed down. He lifted June off the back. She allowed this, and held a hand up for Selene, which she used to step down without making it into anything. He carried her suitcase up the porch steps without asking, which she started to object to and then didn't, because the suitcase was genuinely heavy and her arm was tired. The front door opened before he reached it. Silas Thorne was not what Selene expected either. She had constructed in her mind, somewhere during the wagon ride, an image of Caleb's father as a version of the men who had blocked her way before. Large, suspicious, proprietary, about things that weren't entirely theirs to own. She had built this image from nothing, which she recognized was unfair. But recognition and behavior are different muscles, and hers wasn't always strong. Silas was in his 60s and looked every year of it, but the kind of every year that comes from work and weather rather than from defeat. He was shorter than his son by several inches, with white hair still thick enough to argue with a comb, and eyes that were the same dark shade as Caleb's. He stood in the doorway in his boots and his suspenders over a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it had become its own shade of gray. He looked at Selene. then at Caleb, then at Selene again. "This the woman from the station?" he said. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "Alderman's turn her out?" "More or less." Silas made a sound that was not quite a word and stepped back from the door. "Well, come in then. Coffee's still on." That was all. No questions about who she was or where she'd come from or what she intended. Just come in and coffee's still on, delivered in the tone of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that people were mostly people and the rest was details. Selene stepped inside. The house was warm, not the stifling, artificial warmth of a room that has been closed too long, but the real warmth of a place with a good fire and enough cooking smell still hanging in the air to make it feel occupied. The front room had a long table, mismatched chairs, shelves with books and tools, and things that had no immediate category. Boots by the door in 3 sizes: adult large, child medium, child also medium. A coat rack overwhelmed by its assignment. It looked like a house where people lived. This sounds obvious. It isn't. Selene had been in houses that were performative, rooms arranged to show that the people inside had succeeded at something. She had been in houses that were survival, bare and functional, every surface cleared because there was nothing to put on it. She had rarely been in a house that was simply inhabited, where things accumulated because life was generating things faster than any reasonable person could manage. She stood in the middle of the room and felt something happen in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. "Sit down," Silas said, disappearing toward the back. "Girls' beds." "But," June started, "now." No heat in it, just direction. June looked at Selene with the expression of someone being dragged from an interesting situation before it is fully developed. "Will you be here in the morning?" Caleb set the suitcase down. "That's up to Miss Mercer." "I'll be here in the morning," Selene said. June's face resolved into something like satisfaction. She grabbed Ivy's hand. Ivy allowed this. And they disappeared down the hallway, the sound of their feet against the floorboards loud and then fading. Selene and Caleb stood in the front room. "I should have asked before offering," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the hallway where the girls had gone. "About what the work actually is?" "You probably should have." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that might have been the beginning of a smile, held just short of completion. "The last woman who helped with the girls, my sister-in-law Ruth, she left in April. Her mother's health. I understand it. But June and Ivy have had a difficult time of it since." He paused. "And I'm better at running this ranch than I am at everything else." "What does everything else mean?" "Braiding hair," he said, with the flatness of someone making a confession they find slightly embarrassing. "Knowing when a problem is actually about feelings rather than whatever they're saying it's about. Knowing what to say when something hurts and there's no fixing it." Selene was quiet. "Those aren't small things." "No." He said it plainly. "They're not." Silas came back with 2 mugs and set them on the table without ceremony. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said to Selene. "It's not fancy." "I don't need fancy." "Good." He looked at her for a moment. "You had supper?" She had not had supper. She had been too proud to say so in town, and too tired to figure out how to bring it up on the wagon, and she had been telling herself for the last 2 hours that she wasn't particularly hungry, which was a lie her stomach was currently and loudly contradicting. "No," she said. Silas nodded and went back toward the kitchen. Selene sat at the table. Caleb sat across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who are trying to figure something out and haven't gotten there yet. "Why did you really stop at the station?" Selene asked. Caleb wrapped both hands around his mug. "I needed to check if a delivery manifest had come in on the 4 o'clock. "And had it?" "No." "So you came in for nothing?" "Apparently not," he said. Selene looked at him. He looked back. He wasn't trying to make anything romantic out of that sentence. She could tell by the way he said it, matter of fact, just a thing that was true, which somehow made it land differently than if he'd been trying. She looked down at her coffee. She did not sleep well. The room off the kitchen was as advertised. Small, functional, furnished with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers and a window that looked out on the back of the nearest barn. She lay in the dark listening to the sounds of a working ranch at night. Something shifting in the barn, the wind against the glass, A dog somewhere on the property completing a thorough audit of all things that smelled interesting. She wasn't afraid. She had slept in worse places with less certainty about the morning. But she couldn't stop her mind from processing. "This is someone's charity," said one part of her. "You walked into a stranger's house because you had no other option. That is not salvation. That is just one more thing to owe." "The girls are real," said another part. "The warmth in this house is real. That matters. Real things end," said the first part. "You know that better than anyone." She stared at the ceiling until sometime after midnight and then finally, grudgingly, fell asleep. In the morning, June was standing outside her door when she opened it. Selene pulled up short. June looked up at her, unsurprised. "How long have you been there?" Selene asked. "Not that long." "How long is not that long?" June looked at the window at the end of the hall, calculating. "Since the light changed?" The light had been up for at least an hour. Selene looked down at her. June looked back. She had her hair in two braids that were coming apart at different rates, like she'd redone them herself sometime in the night and gotten partway through before running out of confidence. "Come on," Selene said. Let's find the kitchen." Breakfast was already in motion when they got there. Silas was at the stove, doing something efficient and uncommunicative with eggs and bacon and a cast-iron pan that looked like it had survived several generations. Ivy was at the table with a book open in front of her, eating without looking at what she was eating, which is the particular skill of a child who lives primarily in her own head. Caleb was already gone. "He's up before the sun most days," Silas said without being asked. He handed Selene a plate. "Sit." She sat. June climbed into the chair beside her and immediately began watching Selene eat with the focused attention of a scientist observing something new. Selene decided not to mention it. "Ivy," Silas said, "book down." Ivy turned the page first, then set the book down with her thumb in it. "Down." She set it flat on the table. Silas brought the coffee pot and refilled Selene's mug before she'd finished the first cup. She noticed he hadn't asked whether she wanted more. She noticed she didn't mind. The morning passed in a way she hadn't expected. Not awkward and not forced, but busy in the way of a place that had too many things requiring attention and not enough people to attend to them. Silas gave her a tour of the property in about 20 minutes, which covered the main house, both barns, the bunkhouse where 3 ranch hands lived, the kitchen garden, and the pump house, all delivered in the minimal style of a man who assumed people were competent enough to ask if they had questions. She did have questions, she saved them. The horses she noticed on her own. There were 7 of them in the main barn, a mixed group, well-kept, the kind of horses that told you something good about the people who maintained them. One of them, a gray mare with a white blaze, put her nose over the stall door and looked at Selene with the enormous patience of horses that have decided a person is interesting. Selene held out her hand. The mare sniffed it. "That's Constance," said Ivy from somewhere behind her. "She doesn't usually do that." "Do what?" "Let people touch her right away. She waited 3 weeks before she let Papa." Selene looked at the mare. The mare looked back. "Animals are better judges than people sometimes," Selene said. "Papa says that too," Ivy said. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to stay?" Selene turned. Ivy was standing a few feet away, hands in her coat pockets, looking at Selene the way she had looked at her the night before. Direct, assessing, not unkind, but not soft either. The kind of look that wanted an honest answer. "I don't know yet," Selene said. Ivy nodded once, like that was acceptable, like she could work with that. Word travels fast in small towns, not through any particular mechanism. No town crier, no official announcement, just the 1,000 tiny capillaries of a community where everyone's business is visible to everyone else's windows, and the habit of noticing has been refined over generations into something close to art. By noon of Selene's first full day at Thorn Ridge, most of Dust Creek knew that Caleb Thorne had brought a woman home from the station. By afternoon, the story had grown details it hadn't had at noon. She'd heard the whispers herself, indirectly, when Silas sent her into town for supplies. The woman at the dry goods counter had been polite in the particular way that polite people are when they are being polite as a form of information gathering. The man outside the hardware store had looked at her with the transparent interest of someone who wanted to be seen noticing something. Two women in conversation near the post office went quiet when she passed and resumed. When she was far enough away that they thought she couldn't hear, she could hear. She had very good ears and a lifetime of practice at being the subject of conversations that assumed she couldn't. Caleb Thorne's new woman doesn't look like much, does she? What does that say about his judgment, bringing a stranger home like that? She kept walking. She bought the supplies. She loaded them in the wagon. She drove back to Thorn Ridge with her back straight and her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins. She had been talked about before. She was still here. The first time she met Lenora Pike, she almost missed the significance of it. It happened outside the general store on the second afternoon when Selene was returning a borrowed crate. Lenora came around the corner of the building with a basket over one arm and a woman Selene didn't know on the other side, deep in conversation that stopped the moment Lenora's eyes found Selene. Lenora was a handsome woman in her mid-50s, strong-featured, well-dressed in the way that frontier wealth expressed itself, which was less about flash and more about quality. Silver hair, mostly. Something around the eyes that said she was used to getting what she wanted and had only occasionally been wrong about that. She looked at Selene with an expression that was perfectly constructed to look like nothing at all. "You must be the young woman staying with the Thorns," she said. "Yes," Selene said. "Selene Mercer." Lenora Pike. She said it the way some people say their name, as information they assume is already significant to you. "I've known the Thorn family for a great many years. Caleb's girls are just precious." "They are," Selene agreed. "It's a shame," Lenora said, "that Caleb hasn't been able to find more permanent support for them." She said permanent in the particular way of a word that contains another word inside it, and that other word is appropriate. "Still, I'm sure something will work out." She smiled at Selene with her mouth. She did not smile with anything else. "I'm sure it will," Selene said. Lenora moved past her. The woman on her arm glanced back once. Selene stood with the crate and watched them go. She knew that kind of woman. She had met her in various forms in every place she'd ever lived. The woman who had decided how things should be arranged and resented evidence that her arrangements might be challenged. The woman whose kindness operated as a boundary marker, this far and no further, and know that I am watching. She picked up the crate. She went back to the ranch. She did not tell Caleb about it, because it was too small to be worth naming, and because she had handled things like Lenora Pike before without requiring someone else to handle them for her. She filed it in the part of her mind that kept track of geography, a spot on the map she knew now, a terrain feature to navigate around. The days that followed were not magical. She wanted to be precise about that later. When people asked how she ended up at Thorn Ridge, and eventually people would ask, she had a tendency to resist the simplified version, the one where things clicked into place and hearts opened up and the music swelled. The truth was plainer and more difficult, and in some ways more interesting. The first week was hard. It was not because anyone was cruel to her. They weren't. But because inhabiting a new space takes more out of a person than they expect, especially a person who has been moving for long enough that staying feels like a skill she never quite mastered. She woke up every morning and had to remind herself, just briefly, where she was. She navigated the rhythms of the house. When Silas wanted quiet, when the girls needed attention, when Caleb came in late and ate whatever was left without comment. She made mistakes. Overcooked the beans one night, took a wrong turn in the barn that spooked one of the younger horses, misread Ivy's silence as anger 3 times before she understood it was just the way Ivy thought. She apologized for the beans. She didn't apologize for the horse. It had been an honest mistake, and apologies for honest mistakes can become their own kind of self-punishment. She asked Ivy once, carefully, whether she preferred to be left alone when she was quiet, or whether she wanted company even if no one was talking. Ivy had stared at her for a long moment, and then said in a voice that was slightly less guarded than usual, "Company." After that, Selene simply existed near Ivy sometimes without making it into anything. Reading, mending, folding laundry. Ivy would be at the table with her book, and Selene would be in the chair by the window, and neither of them would say much. And sometimes Ivy would read something out loud. Just a sentence, just a line. And Selene would listen. June, on the other hand, was a different challenge entirely. June's particular form of attachment involved following Selene through most of the house and yard on a near-constant basis, asking a rotating series of questions. Not the easy questions, not the comfortable ones, but the ones that live just slightly outside the perimeter of what adults usually have clean answers for. Why did your family have to move when you were little? Is it lonely, not having sisters? Did you ever want to be somewhere and then get there and it wasn't what you thought? Selene answered all of them, not always completely, but honestly, which she decided was worth more than completely. She was paid, technically. Caleb had outlined something reasonable on the second morning: room, board, and a wage that was fair without being generous, laid out with the directness of a man who found money conversations less awkward than emotional ones. She accepted it. Having her own money was not a small thing. She had learned that early and kept learning it. What she hadn't expected was how the work itself would feel. She had worked all her life, cleaning, cooking, minding other people's children, all the forms of labor that are designated necessary and then systematically not thought about. She had done it competently and without complaint, and mostly without caring about it, because caring about things you have no ownership over is a fast path to a particular kind of misery. But the twins were not other people's children in the same way. She couldn't explain it precisely, and she didn't try. It was something in the way June announced things. Not told Selene, but announced, like Selene was specifically the person who needed to hear this. Something in the way Ivy, 3 weeks in, asked Selene if she would read to her before bed instead of waiting for Silas to do it. She read. Ivy fell asleep after 20 minutes. Selene sat for a while after, in the dim room with the book in her lap, listening to the ranch outside. She wasn't comfortable exactly. She was something harder to name than comfortable. She was beginning to be somewhere. The conversation she'd been avoiding with herself finally caught up with her about a month in. She was at the pump house, working a stuck valve with a wrench she'd borrowed from the equipment barn, when Caleb appeared around the corner with a length of pipe he'd apparently been tasked with replacing. They worked alongside each other for a while in the way of people who have gotten used to shared silence without having discussed it. "You're not planning to leave," Caleb said finally. Not a question exactly. Selene set the wrench down. "What makes you say that?" "The way you've started organizing the supply room." He glanced at her. "A person who's leaving doesn't reorganize things." She looked at the pipe in his hands. "I reorganized it because the previous system made no sense." "I know, I made the previous system." He fitted the pipe into place. "I'm not objecting." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. "All right. That's all you're going to say about it?" He turned to look at her. There was something deliberate in the way he said the next thing, not rehearsed, but chosen. "I'm not good at saying things I feel. I know that about myself. But the girls are better since you came. The house is better, and I noticed that." He turned back to the pipe. "That's what I'll say about it." She stood there. She had been told she was valued before, usually in the same sentence as a reason why the value was about to be reduced. She had been told she was needed, which often meant you are convenient. She had been told she was appreciated, usually right before something was taken away. She did not know, yet, which of those this was. But she noticed that her hands, wrapped around the wrench in the cold afternoon, had stopped shaking. She hadn't realized they'd been shaking. She picked the wrench back up and went back to the valve. After a moment, Caleb said, "The valve threads are stripped. You're going to need to replace the whole fitting." "I know," she said. "I was getting to that." Somewhere across the yard, June's voice rose in the direction of the barn, announcing something to Ivy at considerable volume. The wind came over the hills and moved through the dry grass. Selene Mercer, who had arrived in Dust Creek with a worn suitcase and $7.40, kept working. She did not think, right then, about how long it would last. She did not run the calculations she usually ran. The escape routes, the contingencies, the practiced indifference she kept like a spare coat in case she needed it. She just worked. And the ranch moved around her, as if it had always expected her to be there. The supply room stayed organized. That was the thing Selene noticed first about her own settling in. Not the large moments, not any single conversation, but the small evidence of a person beginning to treat a place as if it matters. The canned goods in rows, labels facing out. The flour and salt and sugar in sealed tins instead of their original paper sacks. Because paper sacks in a drafty kitchen were an invitation to moisture and mice. The tools hung on the wall by the back door in the order most likely to be needed. Work gloves on the peg closest to the exit, then the heavier barn tools, then the things used only occasionally. Nobody asked her to do any of this. Nobody commented when she did. Caleb noticed, the way he'd told her he noticed things, quietly, without making it into a production. One morning she came down to find he'd added a second peg to the row by the door, spaced exactly right for the long-handled implements she'd run out of space for. He'd done it sometime before dawn, before anyone else was up. No note, no mention of it at breakfast. She looked at the new peg for a moment. She hung the pitchfork on it. The days kept moving the way days do in places where the work doesn't stop for weather or mood, or the complications of people trying to figure each other out. October gave way to November, and November brought the kind of cold that had teeth in it. The wind off the open plains finding every gap in every wall and reminding the house that it was, when all was said and done, a collection of wooden nails standing against something much larger than itself. The twins had strong opinions about cold weather. June's opinion was that it was an opportunity to be inside with blankets and books, and the particular pleasure of hearing wind when you were not in it. Ivy's opinion was that cold was no excuse for not doing things, a position she held with the conviction of someone who had decided it was a character issue. They compromised as they usually did by arguing about it until whichever adult was nearest made a decision for them. On most days that adult had become Selene, which she had not planned on and which had happened so gradually, she wasn't entirely sure when it had started. "She said I don't have to go check on the horses if it's too cold," June reported one morning at breakfast, pointing at Selene. "I said you don't have to," Selene said. "I said Ivy didn't need company if she wanted to go alone. That's not the same thing. Ivy always wants to go alone." "That's not true," Ivy said, without looking up from her oatmeal. "Name one time you wanted company in the barn." "Last Tuesday." June frowned. "You didn't say anything." "I'm saying it now." There was a pause. Selene watched June process this. The moment when a person realizes they've been wrong about something and has to decide what to do with that. June was 8 years old and better at this moment than most adults Selene had encountered. "Okay," June said finally. "I'll come today." Ivy looked up. Something shifted in her face. Not a full smile, but adjacent to one. "I know." Silas poured himself more coffee and made no comment on any of this, which was his way of indicating that things were running as they should. Selene ate her oatmeal. She realized, not waiting for something bad to happen this morning. That was new. Or rather, it was new enough that she noticed it. She put the thought away before it could become anything she'd have to examine. The morning moved on. It was the kind of normalcy that looks, from the outside, like nothing much is happening, and from the inside it feels, if you're the kind of person who spent a long time without it, like something extremely fragile that you're trying very hard not to breathe on too forcefully. What Selene didn't know on that particular November morning was that Dust Creek had already made up its mind about her. The town hadn't announced this. It never did. Small towns form opinions the way weather systems form, gradually and then all at once, the accumulation of 100 small observations coalescing into a single pressure front that has its own momentum independent of the facts on the ground. And the person at the center of that pressure front, the one who had been tracking Selene Mercer with the patient attention of a woman who planned several moves ahead, had already decided that the time for simply watching was coming to an end. Lenora Pike had been widowed 11 years ago, when Thomas Pike had the good grace to leave her the largest landholding on the eastern side of Dust Creek and then die quietly without making further complications. She had run the property herself since, with a combination of competence and iron social will that most people in town respected and several of them feared. Her daughter, Adelaide, was 23, pretty, educated at a school in Austin, and in Lenora's long-term vision, the future Mrs. Caleb Thorne. The Thorneland and the Pikeland together would be the kind of combined property that could negotiate with anyone, weather any drought, outlast any bad season. It was a practical plan. It was also, in Lenora's estimation, the only sensible arrangement, which was a category she applied broadly to anything she had decided she wanted. Adelaide herself had feelings about this plan. She had expressed these feelings to her mother on more than one occasion. Lenora had listened to every word and continued planning. The problem was that Caleb Thorne had never expressed any particular interest in Adelaide Pike. and Lenora had been managing this obstacle for 2 years through patience and strategic proximity, arranging that Adelaide happened to be in the same rooms, at the same dinners, on the same stretch of road, at the same times as Caleb, while Lenora smiled and observed and said nothing that could be construed as pressure. Then Selene Mercer had arrived at the Dust Creek station on a Tuesday night with a worn suitcase and somewhere in the neighborhood of nothing, and Caleb had brought her home. And Lenora Pike's patience, which was considerable, had encountered its limit. The rumors she'd started were not lies, precisely. Lenora was too smart for outright lies. They required maintenance and had a tendency to collapse under their own weight. What she spread instead were suggestions, questions, the kind of conversational seeds that grow on their own once planted in the right soil. Has anyone looked into where she actually came from? I'm not saying anything, I'm just wondering. It does seem sudden, doesn't it, the way she's made herself at home out there. I heard she had to leave her last position. I'm sure it's nothing. I just think Caleb deserves to know what he's brought into that house with his daughters. She planted these things the way an experienced gardener plants. In the right season, in the right soil, spaced appropriately so they'd have room to spread. And Dust Creek, which was a town full of people who were not bad people, but who were bored people in the way all small, isolated communities are bored, and for whom a fresh story was a kind of nourishment, Dust Creek received these seeds and did what good soil does. Selene felt the change before she could name it. It was in the 3rd week of November, on a supply run, when the woman at the dry goods counter, Mrs. Fenwick, who had been merely probing before, now had something sharper behind her pleasantness. "Getting settled out at Thorn Ridge?" she asked, wrapping the flower parcel with more deliberateness than the task required. "Well enough," Selene said. "It's an interesting arrangement," Mrs. Fenwick said. "Is it?" "Well, you know how people talk." "I do," Selene said. She kept her voice neutral. "What are they saying?" Mrs. Fenwick blinked. She had expected deflection or discomfort, the response of a woman who felt she owed something to the opinions of others. She had not expected a direct question, delivered without aggression but also without flinching. "Oh, nothing specific," she said, and suddenly found the string for the parcel required her full attention. Selene took her parcel and went to the next item on the list. She was angry. She kept it in the part of her that kept things the same place where she put the cold and the loneliness and the 400 miles and the alderman's door closing with that soft, deliberate click. She put it there because taking it out right now would not help anything, and she had learned, through long and occasionally painful practice, the difference between feelings that needed expressing and feelings that needed storing. What she could not do was decide how much of this to tell Caleb. She had been at Thorn Ridge for 7 weeks. She had a sense of him by now. Not complete. You don't get complete in 7 weeks, but enough. She knew he was direct in the way of people who find indirectness exhausting rather than comfortable. She knew he had a temper that ran slow and ran deep, the opposite of the men who flare and cool quickly. His kind of anger built like a weather system, and once it broke, it had consequences. She knew he cared about his daughters with a ferocity that had no performance in it at all. It was just a fact about him, like the shape of his hands or the way he walked slightly favoring his left leg on cold mornings. She also knew that telling him about the gossip would most likely cause him to do something visible about it. And something visible would confirm everything Lenora's suggestions implied. That Selene was a disruption, a complication, a thing that created problems in a life that already had enough of them. She decided not to tell him. This was, as decisions go, not wrong and not right. It was the decision of someone who is still operating from old muscle memory. The habit of a person who has handled things alone for so long that involving another person feels less like help and more like creating a debt. She drove back to the ranch. She unloaded the supplies. She reorganized the spice shelf because someone had clearly put the paprika where the cayenne was supposed to go, which was the kind of small wrongness that, on a difficult afternoon, was deeply satisfying to correct. "You're doing that thing," said Ivy's voice from the doorway. "What thing?" "The organizing thing. When something's wrong." Selene stopped with her hand on the cayenne. She turned to look at Ivy, who was leaning in the doorframe in the particular way of children who know they are observing something and have decided to be honest about it. "How do you know that?" Selene asked. Ivy shrugged. "Papa does it with fences. When something's bothering him, he goes and fixes all the fences that don't need fixing." Selene put the cayenne in its correct place. "Nothing's wrong," she said. Ivy looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay," in the tone that actually means I don't believe you, but I won't push it. It was an extremely Ivy thing to say. Selene almost smiled. "Go wash up for supper." "It's not supper time yet." "Go wash up early." Ivy went with the elaborate dignity of someone complying under protest. Selene stood in the supply room for a moment alone, with the shelves straight and the labels facing out and the cayenne in its correct position. The wind was picking up outside. She could hear it against the corner of the house, that low moan that meant the temperature was dropping again. She would handle this herself. She always had. She was still telling herself this when the actual difficulty arrived, 3 days later, in the form of a conversation that came to her rather than the one she'd been bracing for. It was Silas who told her. He did it the way he did most things, without announcement or softening, over coffee at the kitchen table on a gray Wednesday morning when Caleb had been out since before light, and the girls were still asleep. "You know what Lenora Pike's been saying around town?" he said. Not a question. Selene looked at him over her mug. "Some of it." "She's saying you had to leave your last job in disgrace, that you're looking for someone to attach yourself to for financial security." He paused. "She's also saying things about your character that I won't repeat because they're not worth the air." Selene held the mug with both hands. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. "Is Caleb hearing this?" she asked. "He's starting to. People talk to him in town." Silas looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you because you should know what's coming, and because I've been watching you for 7 weeks and I have my own opinion, which doesn't match Lenora's." Selene looked at the table. "I didn't leave any job in disgrace," she said. "I left my last position in Kansas because the family relocated and didn't take me with them. Before that, the woman I worked for in St. Louis died, and her children sold the house. Before that—" She stopped. "I have reference letters from every position I've held. I brought them. They're in my room." "I know," Silas said. She looked at him. "You know? I asked to see them. First morning." He said this matter-of-factly. "You were at the barn with Constance. I looked through your suitcase." She stared at him. "You looked through my suitcase," she said. "I did." Without asking. "You were in my son's house with my granddaughters," Silas said, without a trace of apology. "And I didn't know you from a hole in the ground. I'd have done it to anyone." He took a sip of his coffee. The letters were good. The handwriting on one of them, the one from the St. Louis family, was the kind that shakes a little on the downstrokes. Grief does that. She wrote it right after she knew she was losing the woman who'd kept her house for 3 years. He set the mug down. "I decided you were probably what you appeared to be." Selene was very quiet. She was not sure whether to be angry, and she tested the feeling the way you test ice, carefully, applying small pressure. The privacy violation was real. The reasoning behind it was also real. People who had something to hide did not carry 7 years of reference letters they hadn't been asked for. People who were running from something did not bring the paper trail of what they were running from. Silas had looked, and then he had let her in. "You could have told me," she said finally. "I could have," he agreed. "I'm telling you now." It was an imperfect apology that did not call itself an apology, which was, she was beginning to understand, how Thorn men apologized. "What are you going to do about Lenora?" she asked. "Nothing," Silas said. "Lenora Pike's been doing what Lenora Pike does for 30 years, and she always runs into the same problem eventually. The truth." He looked at Selene. "The question is what you're going to do." "About what?" "About telling Caleb." She was quiet. "He'll hear it all eventually," Silas said. "He's already hearing parts. He's a stubborn man, and he'll defend you without knowing what he's defending you from, which puts him at a disadvantage." He paused. "I can tell him, or you can." Selene thought about the fences, about the way Caleb walked the property in the early mornings, working on things that didn't need working on when something was sitting on him, about the way he'd said, at the pump house, "I'm not good at saying things I feel," the plainest, most unguarded sentence she'd heard from him. "I'll tell him," she said. She told him that evening after supper when the girls had gone to do their homework and Silas had excused himself with the particular tact of an old man who knows when a room needs fewer people in it. Caleb was at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of him and a pencil he'd been turning in his fingers for the last 20 minutes without actually writing anything. She sat down across from him and told him what she knew. Not everything she'd felt about it, but the facts, the rumors, the source, what had been said, and what the likely intention behind it was. She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to report difficult things, without excess emotion, because excess emotion in the delivery sometimes caused the listener to focus on the emotion rather than the thing. He was still while she talked. The pencil stopped turning. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough for the wind to push something off the porch outside with a small clatter. "She said you were after my money," Caleb said. His voice was very even. "Something like that." He looked at the ledger. "We're not a rich operation, Miss Mercer. We're a working one. Comfortable, most years. Difficult, some years." "I know that." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you this because I need you to defend me. I'm telling you because Silas said you'd hear it anyway, and I'd rather you hear it from me." He looked up from the ledger. Something moved in his expression. Not the beginning of anger, she realized. Something more careful than that. "What happened at your last job?" he asked. She told him that too. All of it. In the same plain voice. The family in Kansas, the woman in St. Louis, the string of positions before that, each one ended by circumstances that had nothing to do with her competence and everything to do with the precarious nature of being a woman who worked for other people and therefore had her life managed by other people's choices. She told him about arriving in Dust Creek and standing at the alderman's door and hearing that soft, definitive click. When she stopped, he was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Moving?" "Since I was 19? She paused. 7 years. He turned the pencil once. "That's a long time to not have somewhere to be." She looked at the table. "Yes." He didn't say anything else for a while. She could hear the lamp hissing softly and the creak of the house in the wind, and somewhere down the hall, Ivy's voice reading something aloud to June, which June apparently needed help with and would not admit. "Lenora Pike," Caleb said finally, "has wanted me to marry her daughter for 2 years. I'm not going to do that. I've told her as clearly as I know how without being cruel about it, and she has chosen not to believe me." He closed the ledger. "This is not your problem to solve, it's mine." "It's become mine," Selene said. "I know." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry for that." She held his gaze. "Don't be sorry, just don't handle it in a way that makes it worse." Something shifted in his face at that. Not offense. Recognition. He recognized that she was telling him something true about himself. "You think I'll handle it badly. I think you'll handle it directly and immediately, and that will give Lenora exactly what she wants, which is a scene she can interpret." A long pause. "You might be right," he said, which came out like it cost him something. "I'm often right about people," she said, and she meant it without arrogance. It was just a fact about her, the way reading terrain was a fact about him. "It doesn't mean I'm always right about what to do about it." He almost smiled. The same almost smile she'd seen in the station on the first night, held just short of all the way. "I'll think before I do anything," he said. "That's all I'm asking." She stood up. He stayed at the table. "Miss Mercer," he said as she reached the hall. She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." She nodded once and went to her room. She lay in the dark with the sound of the ranch around her and let herself feel, just briefly, the complicated thing that had been building in her chest since she sat down across from him. Not the conversation itself, but the thing underneath it. The fact that she had told him, had trusted him with the real version of events rather than the managed one, had not calculated the outcome first or prepared the retreat route in advance. She had just told him. She was not sure what to do with that. She was not sure there was anything to do with it yet. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind find the gaps in the walls, and after a while the lamp in the hallway went out as Silas made his last round of the house, and then there was only dark and cold and the sound of a working ranch at night, going about its business. Outside, the weather was building. Not the wind they'd had all week. Something heavier. The kind of low-pressed stillness that arrives before a real front moves through, when the air thickens and the horses in the barn stand different. Caleb's gray mare, Constance, had been restless since sundown, shifting and sighing in her stall, which was how she announced that something was coming that she didn't like. Selene had noticed, coming back from the barn after evening rounds. She had noted it the way she noted all the small signs that were accumulating. The clouds moving wrong, the smell of the air, the silence in the grass that usually had insects in it. She didn't know what kind of front it was yet. She would find out. 3 days later, she found out. It began, as disasters on the frontier often do, with something that looked like ordinary bad luck. A windstorm had been building since midday on a Friday, the kind that the plains people knew and the newcomers always underestimated, starting as a strong gusting and escalating through the afternoon into something sustained and driving that found every poorly secured thing on the property and tested it. By evening, the lanterns had to be kept low, and by 9 o'clock the bunkhouse hands were doubling up on the barn latches and piling extra feed in the stalls to keep the horses settled. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since noon. The sky in the east had taken on the bronze quality that meant nothing good. The girls were inside, which Selene was grateful for. She had sent them in after supper with strict instructions not to open any exterior doors, which June had agreed to and Ivy had agreed to with the additional clause of, unless something actually needed her, which Selene had to accept as the best available negotiation outcome. Caleb and 2 of the hands were in the eastern barn, checking the roof structure on a section that had been questionable since the previous spring. Silas was in the house, ostensibly reading but actually sitting in the chair nearest the window where he could see the yard. Selene was crossing the yard between the house and the western barn with a lantern, checking the latch on the grain storage door when she smelled it. Smoke. Not wood smoke, not the familiar smell of the kitchen stove or the bunkhouse hearth. Something hotter and less controlled, the particular smell of something burning that was not meant to be burning. She stopped. She turned, holding the lantern up against the wind. The eastern barn, the one where Caleb was, had a glow at the base of its south wall that had nothing to do with lantern light. Everything that happened next happened very fast, which is how it always is, and simultaneously felt slow in the way that crises slow down your perception until you can see individual seconds. She ran. She hit the eastern barn door at a run and shoved it open, and the smoke came at her immediately. Not thick yet, but present, moving. The fire still low, but finding purchase in the dry wood of the wall and the hay stacked too close to it. Caleb was already moving, pulling the nearest horse by its halter toward the door, shouting at the hands. One of the horses was screaming, that flat, wide-open sound that horses make in real fear, and the others were responding to it, throwing themselves against their stall doors. "Get them out!" Caleb shouted over the wind. She didn't need to be told. She went for the stall farthest from the door, the one with Constance in it, which was the one farthest from the fire, but also the one where the horse was most likely to be difficult. Constance was already up against the back wall, whites showing around her eyes, head high and rigid. "Hey," Selene said. She kept her voice at the same register she used with Ivy. Not loud, not soft, just consistent. "Hey, I've got you." Constance moved sideways away from her. "I know," Selene said. "I know, but we have to go." She got a hand on the halter on the third attempt and held on when the mare threw her head. The smoke was getting thicker. She could hear Caleb behind her, and the hands and the sounds of horses being pushed through the door into the windy dark outside. She kept talking. Not words exactly, just sound, rhythm, the ongoing assertion of a human presence that was not a threat. Constance came. She was not easy about it. She planted and wheeled and made Selene work for every step toward the door. But she came. Selene got her out into the night air and handed the lead to one of the hands and turned back. "All of them?" she said to Caleb, who was outside now, his face dark with smoke shadow. "5 out. I thought 6. He was already counting. June's horse, the smallest horse, a bay pony of no particular beauty named Pocket, who June loved with a devotion Selene had come to recognize as the same quality of love June applied to everything she cared about, complete and without reservation. Selene went back in. The fire had moved faster in the 30 seconds she'd been outside. It was in the south wall proper now, climbing, and the heat had changed from background to presence. She felt it on the side of her face, on the backs of her hands. The smoke stung her eyes. Pocket's stall was in the back corner, the farthest from the door, the closest to the wall that was burning. She heard Caleb behind her. "I'll get it. I'm already in," she said, and kept moving. The bay pony was down. She wasn't hurt. The position was wrong for a fall, more like a crouch, a horse that had pressed itself as small as possible against the back wall of its stall, the way a child hides under a bed. Pocket's whole body was vibrating. "Come on," Selene said. "Up." The pony didn't move. She got in the stall, which was an extremely small space with a very frightened animal and a wall that was beginning to blister on the far side, and she crouched down to the pony's level. The smoke was bad down here too, different, heavier. She pulled her collar up over her nose. She put her hand flat on the pony's neck and left it there. "Pocket," she said. Just the name. Then again, just the name. Then again, and this time she felt the pony's breathing change under her palm. Still fast, still panicked, but the vibrating had changed character, become responsive rather than pure shutdown. "Up," Selene said. "With me." The pony came up. She got the lead clipped and got them moving, and the next 40 feet to the door were the longest 40 feet she had walked in her life, because the smoke was dense enough now that she was navigating by the sound of the wind outside and the faint rectangle of slightly less dark that was the open door, and because the heat from the wall to her left was no longer just uncomfortable, it was urgent. She came through the door into the cold and wind and immediately bent double, coughing. Caleb was there. He took the pony's lead from her hand, and then he had his hand on her shoulder, not gripping, just there. And she coughed until her eyes watered and straightened up to find him looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read in the dark and the smoke haze. "You didn't have to go back in," he said. She looked at the pony. Pocket had found June's scent in the crowd of the yard and was attempting to move toward the house, which the hand holding the lead was preventing with effort. "Yes, I did," Selene said. She heard June's voice from the porch. She'd come outside despite instructions, high and sharp with relief. "Pocket," and Caleb's hand was still on Selene's shoulder, which she noticed without making anything of it, because there were other things to notice right now, the fire most importantly, and the hands working the water line, and Silas directing 2 men to the secondary water source, and the wind that was still wrong in the way it had been all day. The barn burned. They saved most of it. The fire had started low and been caught early, which was the only grace. The south wall was gone, and the attached lean-to structure, and a portion of the roof. The horses were safe. The tools and equipment were mostly lost. Caleb stood at the edge of the yard and looked at it for a long time. He didn't say anything. His jaw was tight in a way she recognized now as the beginning of something building, and she stood beside him because she didn't know what else to do, and walking away seemed wrong. "It started at the base of that wall," he said finally. His voice was careful in the way of someone keeping something contained. "There's nothing stored there. Nothing that would catch." Selene looked at the burned section of wall. She had noticed the same thing on her way in. The stacks of equipment were on the north side, the hay on the far wall. The south wall had been clear. "Wind could have carried something," she said. "Maybe." He said it like he didn't believe it. She didn't believe it either. In the morning, when the light was gray and flat, and the wind had finally exhausted itself, Caleb walked the perimeter of the burned section alone for an hour. She watched from a distance without making it obvious she was watching. When he came back inside, his face had closed over into something she hadn't seen before, a kind of deliberate calm that was not calm at all. "There's oil residue in the soil," he said, "about 8 feet north of where the fire started. Someone carried it there, and I want to know who." He said it to Silas and Selene together, at the kitchen table with the girls still asleep. The kitchen was quiet except for the coffee and the ticking of the clock on the shelf. Silas set his mug down carefully. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Silas looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Selene. She looked back. In the silence between them passed a thing that neither of them said aloud, because Caleb was already thinking it, and it didn't need to be said yet. The name of the woman who had been building pressure for months, whose arrangements had been complicated by the presence of one Selene Mercer, whose patience had been formidable, and whose limit, as Silas had suggested, was the truth. The truth, apparently, was more than she'd been willing to wait for. Caleb pressed his hands flat on the table. The controlled anger was in his voice when he spoke. Not loud, precisely the opposite of loud. "My daughters were in this house when that fire started. Pocket was in that barn." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The oil residue sat in the soil like a confession nobody had made yet. Caleb spent 2 days not doing what every instinct told him to do, which was go directly to Lenora Pike's property and say the thing that was sitting in his chest like a coal. Selene had asked him to think before he acted, and he was thinking, visibly, the way men think when they're holding something in that wants badly to be let out. He fixed 4 fence sections that didn't need fixing. He rehung a barn door that had been hanging fine for 3 years. He came in late for supper 2 nights running and ate without tasting anything. Silas watched him the way you watch a pressure gauge. Selene watched the girls. June had been quiet since the fire in a way that was wrong for her. The chattiness dialed down. The questions fewer. She kept finding reasons to be in the barn where Pocket was stabled with the other horses in the temporary arrangement Caleb had rigged against the west wall. She would stand in front of the pony's stall and not say anything, just stand there with her hand on the wood. And Selene understood this because she had her own version of it. The need to physically confirm that a thing still exists after you've nearly lost it. Ivy, on the other hand, had gone the opposite direction. She was more present than usual, more alert, tracking the adults in the house with the quiet precision of a child who has understood that something dangerous happened and that the adults around her are still figuring out what to do about it. She didn't ask about the fire directly. She asked around it, the way you probe the edges of something hot without touching the center. Who would do that? She said one afternoon, sitting across from Selene at the kitchen table while Selene worked through a basket of mending. Selene looked up. Do what? Ivy looked at her steadily. Start a fire on purpose. Selene held her gaze. What makes you think it was on purpose? Papa doesn't fix fences when things happen by accident, Ivy said. He only does that when he's angry about something someone did. This was, Selene reflected, a completely accurate analysis, delivered by a 9-year-old who had apparently been paying closer attention than any of the adults had accounted for. She set the mending down. Some people, she said carefully, make bad choices when they feel like they're losing something they thought they were supposed to have. Ivy considered this. Is it because of you? Selene didn't look away. Partly. Are you going to leave because of it? The question landed with the directness that Ivy applied to everything. No softening around it, no protective padding. Just the thing itself, asked plainly, because she needed to know. No, Selene said. Ivy looked at her for a long moment, the way she did when she was deciding whether to believe something. Then she picked up her book from the table and opened it to her page, which was as close as she got most days to saying, okay, good. The third morning after the fire, Caleb came to breakfast and ate the whole meal and put his plate in the basin and then turned around and said, to no one in particular, I'm going to see Walt Greer. Walt Greer was the closest thing Dust Creek had to a lawman. Not a sheriff exactly, more of a man the town had collectively decided was trustworthy enough to handle things that needed handling. He was in his 50s, deliberate in his manner, and had a quality Selene had observed on her supply runs of listening fully before he said anything, which was rarer than it should be. Silas looked at Caleb over his coffee. Just to tell him what you found. Just to tell him what I found, Caleb said. He looked at Selene. You were right about the scene. I didn't touch the oil line. Greer needs to see it first. She nodded. Take Silas. Caleb frowned. I don't need... Not for protection, she said. Silas knows Greer better than you do. He knows how to present a thing without it looking like a vendetta. A pause. Caleb looked at his father. Silas set his mug down. She's not wrong. They left after breakfast. Selene stayed at the ranch with the girls and the slow, difficult work of a morning that felt like waiting, which she had never been good at. She kept herself busy. There was always enough to keep a person busy at Thorn Ridge, which she had come to appreciate for this exact reason. A property demanded attention, and attention was a thing she could direct. She was in the kitchen garden when June found her. June came around the corner of the house at a half-run with her coat unbuttoned, which meant she'd left the house quickly, and Ivy had either not noticed or not successfully argued about the coat. She stopped when she reached Selene, slightly breathless, and looked at her with the particular expression she wore when she had decided to say something she'd been holding back. I heard what Ivy asked you, June said, yesterday, in the kitchen. Selene kept working the row she was on. And I want to ask you something different. Selene looked up. Go ahead. June wrapped her arms around herself against the cold, coat still open. Do you want to stay? It was a different question from Ivy's. Ivy had asked, are you going to leave? Which was really a question about external forces, about whether the pressure from outside was going to dislodge her. June was asking something interior, something about Selene's own wanting, which was a thing people asked her about less often than they should. Selene sat back on her heels. The garden soil was cold, and the sky was the flat white of a November morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to do anything. Yes, she said. I want to stay. June looked at her for a moment. Her face went through something complicated. Relief, and something underneath the relief that was more serious. Even if it's hard? Things I've wanted have generally been hard, Selene said. That's not new information. June nodded slowly, the way she did when something matched a theory she'd already been developing. Then she climbed up onto the low stone border of the garden bed and sat there with her feet dangling, apparently intending to keep Selene company for the rest of the morning, which she did, filling the silence with a rotating inventory of observations about clouds, horses, the structural properties of different types of fencing, and the ongoing narrative injustice of Ivy being allowed to stay up 15 minutes later than her. Selene worked and listened, and the morning was ordinary and cold, and nothing catastrophic happened in it, which was its own kind of relief. Walt Greer came to Thorn Ridge the following afternoon. He came alone, which Selene took as a sign he was treating it seriously rather than as a social matter. He walked the burned section of the east barn with Caleb for 40 minutes, crouching where the oil residue was, examining the point of origin of the fire, asking short questions and listening to the answers. He had the manner of someone who has seen enough things to know that the story a scene tells is usually more reliable than the story a person tells. Selene brought coffee out to the yard. Greer took a cup and looked at her with the mild, assessing quality she'd noticed in town. You were here the night it happened, he said. Yes. When did you first smell smoke? She told him. He listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions, both specific, both about geography and timing rather than about her. When she answered, he nodded and made a note on the small pad he carried. Miss Mercer, he said, did anyone express concern to you directly in the weeks before this happened? Any threats, stated or implied? She thought about the conversation outside the general store, the particular construction of Lenora Pike's smile. Nothing direct, she said. Implications. From Lenora Pike. Greer's expression did not change. He wrote something on his pad. Anyone else? Not to me personally. I've heard the gossip. I don't know the source of all of it. He nodded. He closed the pad. He looked at the burned wall for a moment with the look of a man filing something in a mental location he'd be able to retrieve later. Thank you, he said. He spoke to Caleb for another few minutes near the gate, too low for Selene to hear from where she stood. Then he mounted his horse and rode back toward town at a steady pace, not hurrying. Caleb came back to where she was standing. He'll look into it, he said. What does that mean exactly? With Walt Greer, it means what it says. He looked at the burned wall. He doesn't make promises he can't keep, and he doesn't announce things before they're ready. He'll find what there is to find. And if he finds it, then Lenora Pike will have a problem that's larger than a social one. He turned away from the wall. Come on, the girls are starting to argue about something, and I can hear it from here. She couldn't hear anything. She looked at him. Ivy's voice does a specific thing when she's losing an argument, he said. Gets very precise, like she's reading from a document. Selene listened. After a moment, from inside the house, she could just barely make out Ivy's voice reaching a particular register. Clipped, exact, each word placed with the care of someone who is making absolutely sure they cannot be misquoted. She laughed. It surprised her. The sound of it, coming out complete without her planning it. Caleb looked at her. She got the sense it surprised him too, and that he was filing it in the same mental location as a number of other things. They walked back to the house. The week that followed was the strangest of Selene's time at Thorn Ridge, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the absence of drama, which turned out to have its own particular tension. Greer was moving quietly through town, asking questions in the understated way of a man who knows that visible investigation changes what people say, and invisible investigation finds out what they actually know. Word got back, in the small-town way, that he had spoken to the Pike Ranch hands, that he had been to the hardware merchant on the South End asking about lamp oil purchases, that Adelaide Pike had been seen leaving Greer's place in town with a face that suggested the visit had not been comfortable. Selene heard these reports through Silas, who had his own network of information that operated through decades of established trust and the particular social capital of an old man who had lived somewhere long enough to know where all the routes went. She was not idle during this time. The East Barn needed assessment for rebuilding, and Caleb had pulled in a carpenter from 3 towns over to look at the structure. Selene, who had spent enough years around working properties to have absorbed more practical knowledge than she'd ever formally learned, found herself in the middle of those conversations without entirely meaning to, pointing out where the original framing had been weak before the fire, suggesting a change in the orientation of the ventilation louvers that would make the interior better for the horses in summer heat. The carpenter, a broad, quiet man named Hessler, had looked at her over his measuring string with moderate surprise and then incorporated her suggestions without comment, which was the highest form of professional compliment she could think of. Caleb had watched this exchange from across the yard. He didn't say anything about it. That evening, after supper, he put a set of property maps on the table between them and said, "Tell me what you see." She looked at him. "The south pasture drainage," he said. "Silas thinks we've been losing ground to water pooling for 3 seasons, but he can't figure out where it's coming in from. I've had 3 sets of eyes on it. Tell me what you see." She looked at the maps. She spent 15 minutes with them, asking questions, making him point out the areas he'd already checked, tracing the elevation lines with her finger. He sat across from her and answered every question without the slight impatience she'd noticed in some men when a woman took time to think rather than rushing to an opinion. "It's coming in from the northwest," she said finally. "This ridge." She put her finger on it. "When the spring thaw runs off, it's moving subsurface until it hits this clay layer here, and then it spreads. You need a diversion channel about 200 feet north of where the pooling starts." Caleb looked at where her finger was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned the map slightly and looked at it from a different angle. He said. "Is that wrong?" "No." He turned the map back. "My father said Northwest Ridge 6 months ago, and I didn't listen because the surface drainage runs east." He was quiet again. "I'll look at it in the morning." He did. He came back in 2 hours later with dirt on his boots and a look on his face that meant she'd been right, which he confirmed in 3 words before going back outside to plan the channel work. She stood in the kitchen and felt a thing that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but had elements of both. The specific pleasure of being useful in a way that went past her original job description. She was not just keeping the house and the girls. She was thinking alongside the people who were trying to keep this place alive, and they were letting her, which was a thing that had not been offered to her before, not like this. The pleasure lasted about 4 hours, until the afternoon of the same day when it ran directly into the thing she'd been expecting. She was in town alone, on a supply run she'd made so often now that the route was automatic, when Lenora Pike stepped out of the milliner's shop directly into her path. It was possible it was coincidence. Selene didn't believe it was. Lenora looked at her with the expression she always used, perfectly constructed, the hostility visible only if you knew exactly where to look for it. She wore a good coat and her silver hair was dressed carefully, and she had the bearing of a woman who believes that posture is a form of argument. "Miss Mercer," she said, "I heard Caleb's been having some difficulty with the East Barn." "The East Barn is being rebuilt," Selene said. She kept moving. She did not stop because stopping would be accepting an invitation to a conversation she had not agreed to have. Lenora kept pace beside her, which required a certain nerve. A terrible thing, a fire, especially with children in the house. She paused a beat too long. "I imagine it makes you think about the risks of your situation." Selene stopped. She hadn't planned to. The stopping happened before the thinking, which was not her best pattern, but was occasionally the honest one. She turned and looked at Lenora Pike directly, in the full afternoon light of Dust Creek's main street, where anyone who happened to be passing could see them. "Mrs. Pike," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." Lenora's expression remained pleasantly neutral. "Of course. What is it, exactly, that you think you're going to accomplish?" A pause. Something moved behind Lenora's eyes. Recalibration. She had not expected the question to be that simple. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. "I think you are." Selene kept her voice even. Not loud, not hard, just consistent. You've been spreading stories about me since I arrived. You've suggested I'm dishonest, that I'm opportunistic, that I'm a danger to a family I've done nothing but work for. That hasn't worked the way you planned. She let that sit for a moment. Now there's a fire, and you're on the street telling me I should think about risks. She looked at Lenora carefully. What comes next? Lenora's pleasant expression had gone very still. I find that question rather offensive, she said finally. I imagine you do, Selene said. Good day, Mrs. Pike. She walked away. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she was aware of this, aware also that anyone watching her would not know it because she'd had enough practice at walking steadily when her hands were doing otherwise. She went to the dry goods and bought what was on the list and loaded the wagon and drove back to the ranch without stopping. She didn't feel good about the conversation exactly. It had not been a strategic move. It had been the thing that came out when the management failed, and the management had failed because Lenora had said children in the house in that precise way, implying danger while pretending to express concern, and something in Selene had simply refused to pretend that wasn't what it was. She told Caleb that evening because she had made a commitment to herself after the first time to stop keeping things that affected him out of his knowledge. She told it plain, the same way she'd told everything else. He listened. His jaw did the thing. You asked her directly, he said. Yes. What did she say? That she found the question offensive. Something passed through his expression. It might have been, in a different man, something close to grim amusement. She say anything after that? I didn't give her the opportunity. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the pencil from the table and set it back down without turning it. I'm going to speak to her. Caleb, not like that. He looked at her. Not a scene, not in town. I'm going to go to her property and tell her, privately, that if anything else happens on this ranch, I will take everything Walt Greer has collected and bring it to every person in this county who has any interest in knowing. He paused. And that her daughter is a fine young woman who deserves better than being used as a chess piece. Selene looked at him. That last part is true. I know it is. Adelaide told Greer she didn't know anything about the oil. I believe her. His voice was flat and certain. The choices her mother makes are not her fault. It was a generous thing to say, more generous than most people would manage in his position. She filed it in the growing internal account she kept of things that told her who Caleb Thorne actually was, below the guarded exterior and the tight jaw and the fences he fixed when he was angry. He went to Lenore Pike's property 2 days later, on a cold Tuesday morning, alone. He was gone 4 hours. When he came back, he came directly into the kitchen, poured himself coffee, and stood at the counter drinking it. How did it go? Silas asked. She denied everything, Caleb said. Politely, specifically, like she'd prepared. He drank his coffee. Then I told her what Greer has. She stopped being polite. But she's not stupid. He set the mug down. She knows what evidence does in a county where land rights depend on your reputation. He was quiet for a moment. I think it's done. Selene was at the table with the account ledger she'd been helping Silas sort, and she looked up. You think or you know? I think, he said. There's no knowing with people. You can just make the cost high enough that the calculation changes. Silas made the small sound that meant he agreed. Selene went back to the ledger. The numbers in front of her were the ordinary arithmetic of a working ranch. Feed costs, repair costs, the careful balance of income against expenditure that was Thornridge's actual daily reality. She had come to know this ledger the way she had come to know the supply room and the kitchen and the timing of the horses, as a language she was learning to read fluently. The days that followed were quieter. Greer made one more trip to the ranch with a written account of what he'd found, which he left with Caleb in a sealed envelope with the suggestion that it be kept somewhere safe. The gossip in town didn't stop. Small towns don't stop talking, not ever. But it changed character. The edge came out of it. People who had been cool to Selene at the dry goods or the post office began to be merely neutral, which in the social economy of Dust Creek was a significant upgrade. Mrs. Fenwick, at the dry goods counter, asked one Wednesday how the East Barn reconstruction was coming along, in the tone of someone making genuine conversation rather than gathering intelligence. Selene told her. Mrs. Fenwick said she was glad the horses were all right. It was a small exchange, about 2 minutes, and it meant almost nothing by the standards of the larger world. By the standards of Dust Creek, it was a recalibration. The barn went up slowly. November became December, and the cold settled in properly. The deep kind that didn't apologize for itself. The frame of the new east wall went up on a Thursday with all 3 ranch hands and the carpenter and Caleb working through short gray daylight hours. And Selene brought coffee and food out at noon without being asked. And nobody commented on this as unusual, which meant it wasn't unusual anymore. She stood at the edge of the build site with her coat pulled close and watched the frame rise against the winter sky and felt the thing in her chest that had been building for weeks without her permission. The dangerous, inconvenient, entirely unwelcome thing. She was attached, not to the property, not exactly, though the property was part of it, not to the work, though the work was part of it, to the specific weight of this place, the way June's voice sounded different when she was reading aloud versus when she was talking, and how Selene had come to be able to tell which was which from the other room. The way Ivy sometimes came and sat in Selene's doorway in the evening just to be near without making it into anything. The way Silas, at breakfast, always refilled her coffee before she finished the first cup, without asking, every morning without exception. And Caleb, the specific fact of him, which she was doing her inadequate best to not look at directly. He was at the top of the frame now, with the carpenter, working a joint that required 2 pairs of hands. She watched him work, efficient, focused, no wasted motion. He said something to Hessler and Hessler laughed, which meant it was something dry, because Hessler was not a man who laughed easily. She looked away before he looked down. She was attached, and this was a problem because she was still operating somewhere in the basement of herself on the assumption that the attachment would eventually be corrected by the world, as it always had been. That some circumstance would shift, that a door would close, soft and deliberate, and she would be on the wrong side of it again. She didn't know how to stop waiting for that. What she did know was that she was still here. That she had been still here through the fire and the gossip and Lenora Pike on the street and 400 miles in a worn suitcase and $7.40. Still here, and the frame was going up, and the horses were in the western barn making their ordinary horse sounds. And inside the house, Ivy and June were doing their schoolwork at the kitchen table with what she could only describe as half-hearted dedication. She turned and went back inside. "Ivy," she said, coming through the door, "you've been on that same arithmetic page for 45 minutes. "The problems are bad," Ivy said. "The problems are the same as last week." "Last week was also bad." June looked up from her reader. "I finished mine." "You did them wrong," Ivy said. June looked at her paper. Her face did the thing it did when she suspected Ivy was right and was hoping very hard she wasn't. "How do you know?" "Because you did them in 12 minutes, and there are 15 problems." There was a short, charged silence. "Selene," June said, "is it possible to do 15 arithmetic problems correctly in 12 minutes?" Selene hung her coat. "Depends on the problems and the person." She pulled out the chair beside June and sat down. "Let me see them." June slid her paper over with the expression of someone bracing for a verdict. Selene looked through the problems. 11 of 15 were correct. 1 was a carrying error. 3 had the right method and the wrong final step, the kind of mistake that came from rushing rather than not knowing. "You got 11 right," Selene said. June sat up. "See?" she said to Ivy. 11 out of 15 is not all of them," Ivy said. "It's most of them." Selene slid the paper back. 4 to fix. Pay attention to what happens when you carry. June pulled the paper back and bent over it with renewed focus. Ivy went back to her arithmetic. The kitchen settled into the particular sound of children working, pencils, erasing, the small sounds of concentration. The barn frame creaked outside as the men worked it into place. The clock on the shelf ticked. Selene sat at the table and corrected the ledger entry she'd gotten wrong that morning, and the afternoon moved around her, cold and ordinary and quietly, insistently alive. She was still waiting for the door to close, but it stayed open. The east barn wall went up on a Thursday and came down in a way nobody planned on a Saturday. Not the wall itself. The wall held. What came down was something else, something that had been building in the spaces between conversations and the particular quality of silences that had been accumulating between Selene and Caleb like water behind a poorly maintained dam. Neither of them had named it, Neither of them had particularly tried to. The Saturday in question started ordinary. Selene was up before the girls, which was normal, and before Silas, which was unusual but not unheard of on the mornings when sleep decided it was done with her before she was done with it. She lit the stove and put the coffee on and stood in the kitchen in the early dark, listening to the house breathe around her. The particular sounds of a structure in cold weather, the wood contracting, the wind finding its habitual roots through the gaps it had mapped over years of trying. She had been at Thorn Ridge for 11 weeks. She knew this because she had not been counting, and the fact that she knew it anyway told her something about the state she was in. Caleb came in from his pre-dawn round of the property at 6:15, stomping snow off his boots at the door. The first real snow of December, 2 inches overnight, enough to change how everything looked without changing how anything worked. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter, and they were both in the kitchen in the early quiet, and it was entirely unremarkable, which was itself remarkable, because at some point in the last 11 weeks, the two of them in the same room before the rest of the house woke up had become ordinary. "The northwest channel markers are holding," he said. "Ground's frozen enough that the drainage work should keep through spring." "Good," she said. He drank his coffee. She turned the bacon in the pan. The snow outside made the morning light different, whiter, more diffuse, the world slightly more hushed than usual. "June asked me something last night," he said. Selene looked up. He was looking at his mug rather than at her. "She asked if you were going to be here for Christmas." A pause. Christmas was 3 weeks away. She had not thought about Christmas, specifically, had not let herself think about it the way she hadn't let herself think about a number of specific things that involved her being somewhere at a defined future point in time. "What did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her that was a question for you." He looked up then. "Is it?" It was not a question exactly, or it was a question that contained several other questions inside it, the way his sentences sometimes did, layered, each layer requiring a decision about how far down to go. She turned the bacon again. "Yes," she said. "I'll be here." He nodded. He finished his coffee. He went back out to the property because there was always something requiring attention on a working ranch, especially in the first snow. She stood at the stove and let the words she'd just said sit in the kitchen with her, solid and slightly terrifying, the way honest things sometimes are. She would be here for Christmas. She had committed to a specific future point in time. She turned the bacon a third time, which it didn't need, because her hands wanted something to do. The thing that actually broke open happened that afternoon, and it was not, as things rarely are, the dramatic version. It was not a confrontation or a crisis. It was a door left open that shouldn't have been, and a conversation heard by someone who wasn't supposed to hear it. Selene was in the hallway outside the front room when she heard Caleb's voice and understood, from the second word, that this was a telephone call, which meant he was in the small back room where the ranch telephone had been installed the previous year, and which had a door that did not latch properly if you didn't pull it hard enough. He hadn't pulled it hard enough. She should have walked away. She knew this while she was not walking away. "Not looking for that," Caleb was saying. His voice was low and measured, the particular register of someone having a conversation they'd prepared for. "I understand what you're implying, and I'm telling you, it's not the situation." A pause while the other end spoke. "She works for us," Caleb said. "She's been here nearly 3 months, and she's—" Another pause. He stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was different, less measured, more the way he sounded when he was being honest because he'd decided to be rather than because it was comfortable. "She's not what I planned on. That's all I can tell you." She walked away then. She went to the kitchen and stood at the window looking at the snow-covered yard and the rebuilt east barn wall and the tracks Caleb had left in the snow on his morning round. And she stood there long enough for the cold from the glass to come through to her hands. And then she made herself move. Made herself start on something practical, because practical was the mode she could reliably operate in when everything else was uncertain. She did not process what she'd heard. She filed it. She was good at filing things. The filing held until after supper, when the girls were in bed and Silas had taken himself off to his room with his book and his pipe, and Caleb was at the table with the ledger again, except he wasn't looking at it, which was how she knew he was thinking about the same thing she was thinking about. She sat down across from him. He looked up. "Who are you talking to this afternoon?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. She had learned not to fill his silences. He was not stalling, he was thinking, and there was a difference. My brother-in-law, he said, in Abilene, Ruth's husband. Ruth, the sister-in-law who had left in April. The one the girls still occasionally mentioned in the distant way of children who understood that a departure was complicated. What did he want? Caleb looked at the ledger. He called to tell me Ruth won't be coming back. Her mother's condition is permanent. He paused. He also took the opportunity to ask questions about the current arrangement here. He'd heard things. From Dust Creek or from somewhere else? Does it matter? It matters if Lenore's network extends to Abilene, she said. He almost smiled, without humor in it. Fair. He turned the pencil. He was not unkind about it. He was concerned. About me. About me, Caleb said. About my judgment. He looked at her. He asked if I was thinking clearly. She held his gaze. Are you? A long pause. Long enough to become its own kind of answer. I don't know, he said, which was the most honest thing he could have said, and they both knew it. She looked at the table, the ledger between them with its careful columns of numbers, all the arithmetic of keeping something alive. Caleb, she said, and using his name without the formal prefix still felt like stepping onto ice she hadn't fully tested. What your brother-in-law heard, what the town is saying, is that something is happening here that isn't what it appears to be, something that reflects badly on your judgment and my character. She looked up, and I need to know if you think that's true. He put the pencil down. No. No. Which part? Any of it. His voice was flat and certain, the voice he used for things he'd already decided. My judgment is that you've been good for this ranch and for my daughters, and I don't have a lower opinion of that because people with their own interests have chosen to tell a different story. Vos iki. He paused. And your character. I've watched you for 11 weeks, Miss Mercer. I've watched you every day in situations you didn't know I was watching, which is the most honest view you get of a person. I have no concerns about your character. She was quiet. Something in her chest was doing something inconvenient. What did you say to him? She asked. I told him the situation was mine to manage. He looked at her. And then I told him she's not what I planned on. The sentence sat between them exactly the way it had sat in the hallway an hour ago, with all the weight of the thing neither of them had said. Selene looked at the man across the table from her, the dark hair and the jaw that still needed a razor more often than it got one, and the hands flat on the table beside the ledger and the expression on his face that was not guarded. That was the opposite of guarded. That was just present, looking at her. Caleb, she said very carefully, I'm still waiting for something to go wrong. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean, she stopped, started again. I have spent 7 years moving. Every time something started to feel like it might hold, something didn't hold. And I know, I am aware, that this is not the same as that. But I don't know how to stop waiting for the version where you decide this was a mistake, where some circumstance changes, where I pack the suitcase again. He was quiet for a moment. That's not a small thing, he said, which was what he'd said when she'd told him that belonging somewhere wasn't a small thing, 3 months and a world ago at the pump house. No, she agreed. He looked at the table. When he spoke, it was with the careful cadence of someone who has thought through what they're going to say because they know they're not good at this and they're going to do it anyway. I'm not good at this, he said, confirming her read. I was better at it once, before... He stopped. This was the place he didn't go easily, she knew. The absence at the center of Thorn Ridge that nobody named directly, that existed in the size of the girls' beds, and the way Silas sometimes looked at the photograph on the mantel shelf in the front room when he thought no one could see him. I got careful, Caleb said. After. I got very careful about what I let matter. I know, she said. He looked at her. The girls matter. This ranch matters. And you... He stopped again. But this time it wasn't the stop of someone who couldn't say it. It was the stop of someone choosing the right word. You matter, he said. I don't know what to do with that entirely. But you matter. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the snow was still, and the dark was the particular dark of a winter night in open country, everything muffled and close. Selene looked at the man across the table who had turned his daughter's lives around because they'd almost smiled at a stranger in a station, who fixed fences when he was angry and rehung doors that didn't need rehanging, and once, in the early dark before anyone else was awake, added a peg to the wall without saying anything about it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She said it the way she'd said, "I'll be here for Christmas." Solid, forward-placed. "I'm not going to stop waiting overnight. That's not how it works. But I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. That was all. But it was the right all right, the one that meant something had been decided, not performed. She pushed back her chair and stood up. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Miss Mercer." She paused at the door to the hall. "Selene," she said without turning around. "It's been 11 weeks. A brief silence. "Good night, Selene," he said. She went to her room. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the thing in her chest that had no clean name. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly, something more complicated and more durable than either. The kind of feeling that comes when a thing you've been bracing for turns out to be a different thing than you expected. Softer in some places, harder in others, more real than either version you'd prepared for. She did not sleep quickly. But when she did, it was different from the way she'd been sleeping for 7 years, without the part of her brain that stayed half on, monitoring for the exit. 3 days later, the thing she hadn't expected happened. It arrived in the form of a letter, which Silas brought in from the post with the rest of the mail and set in front of her at the kitchen table without comment, which meant he'd looked at the return address and decided she should see it without anyone telling her how to feel about it first. The letter was from a woman named Dorothea Marsh in Kansas City. She was the sister of the employer who had died in St. Louis, the one whose handwriting shook on the downstrokes, who had written Selene's reference letter while she was still grieving. Dorothea Marsh wrote in a firm, businesslike hand that was the opposite of her sister's, and she wrote to say that she had spent 6 months settling her sister's estate and had discovered in the course of doing so that her sister had set aside a small sum specifically for Selene. $240. The letter said Selene needed only to confirm her whereabouts and the funds would be sent. Selene read the letter twice. $240 was not a fortune. It was also not nothing. It was enough to get somewhere, to start something, to have options. It was the kind of money that changed the arithmetic of a person's situation. She set the letter on the table. June, who had been watching from across the room with the attentiveness of someone who could read the significance of letters even without reading the letters themselves, said, "Is something wrong?" "No," Selene said. "Something's right, actually." She folded the letter. "Someone was kind to me a long time ago, and I'm just finding out about it." June absorbed this. "Is that sad or good?" "Both," Selene said. "Those aren't always separate." June nodded like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Selene put the letter in her room and went back to the day's work and didn't think about what the money meant in terms of options, because she had told Caleb she wasn't going anywhere and she meant it, and the money didn't change that. But she was aware of it, the fact of it, the way it shifted something in the interior arithmetic. She was not at Thorn Ridge because she had no other option. She was here because she chose to be here, and that was a different thing, and it mattered to know it. She told Caleb about it that evening because she had made a habit of telling him things. He listened. When she finished, he said, "Are you going to write back?" "Yes." "And the money?" She looked at him. "I'm going to keep it." He nodded. Nothing in his expression suggested he thought the money changed anything. She appreciated this about him. The absence of the slight tightening she'd seen in other men when a woman's financial situation improved, the instinct to recalculate. He just nodded, like it was simply good news, like she was simply entitled to have it. "Good," he said, and went back to the fence plan he'd been drawing. The days between that conversation and Christmas were the strangest and in some ways the best of the 11 months Selene would later think of as the year everything shifted. Strange because normalcy, when you're not used to it, feels strange. The way your eyes take a moment to adjust when you move from dark into light, even when the light is what you wanted. And best because of the quality of ordinary life, which she was learning to value in a way she hadn't been able to before. The barn wall was finished on a Tuesday. Hessler stood back and looked at it with the expression of a craftsman considering whether his work meets his own standards, which are always higher than anyone else's, and gave a single slow nod that meant yes. Caleb shook his hand. The ranch hands went back to their other work. The horses were moved back into the east stalls, and Pocket went to his corner and stood there with his customary expression of mild, ongoing grievance. And June stood outside the stall door and told him, at some length, about everything that had happened while he'd been displaced. Pocket listened with one ear forward and one ear back, which is how horses listen when they're paying partial attention and finding it sufficient. Selene watched from the barn door and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the night of the fire. It was done. The burned thing was rebuilt. The structure held. She turned that thought over for a moment before she let it go. The week before Christmas, Dust Creek held its annual market day, a tradition that predated the town's official incorporation, Silas said, going back to when it was just a trading post and 3 families who'd decided to stay. The main street was cleared and stalls set up, and people came from neighboring ranches and the smaller settlements nearby. And for one Saturday in December, the town was larger than itself. Selene went with the girls and Silas while Caleb stayed back to deal with a supply delivery he'd been waiting on. She had been to Dust Creek in all its ordinary iterations, the dry goods, the post, the hardware merchant, but she had not been to it like this, as part of a group that had a recognized social presence. She noticed the difference almost immediately. People who had been neutral to her in recent weeks were now speaking to Silas, and by extension to her, not warmly, most of them, not yet, but normally, which was its own form of progress. Mrs. Fenwick stopped them at the jam stall and talked to Silas for several minutes about the barn reconstruction with what appeared to be genuine interest, and at one point turned to Selene and said, "I heard you had some ideas about the ventilation." And Selene said yes, and they talked about it, and it was simply a conversation between 2 people about a practical matter, and Mrs. Fenwick listened and responded, and that was all it was, and that was enough. June bought a small wooden horse with her saved pocket money and made Selene hold it while she examined every other item at the toy stall with the thoroughness of a buyer who has committed but wants to confirm the commitment was correct. Ivy found a secondhand book she'd been wanting and bargained the price down by 15 cents through sheer reasonable argument, which the stall owner accepted with the expression of someone who had been outmaneuvered but couldn't find the flaw in the logic. They were walking back toward where they'd left the wagon when Adelaide Pike stepped into their path. Not deliberately, Selene could see from the way she'd come around the corner of the milliner's that she hadn't known they'd be there. Adelaide stopped. She was a young woman, actually, not the formidable weapon her mother had tried to make her, just a young woman in a good coat who looked, at that moment, like someone who had been having a difficult several months and was tired of it. She looked at Selene. Selene looked back. Silas, beside her, said nothing, which was his form of giving her the floor. "Miss Mercer," Adelaide said. She paused, like she was deciding something. "I owe you something in the way of an apology." Selene waited. "I didn't know about the fire," Adelaide said. "Not before it happened. I want you to know that. I told Mr. Greer and I'm telling you." Her chin was up, but her voice had something in it that wasn't quite steady. "What was done to your family's property? I would not have—" She stopped. "It was not right." The word "your family's property" landed on Selene in an unexpected way. She felt it. She let herself feel it for exactly a moment. "I believe you," Selene said. Adelaide looked at her, slightly surprised, like she'd prepared for more difficulty than she was getting. "My mother's decisions are her own," she said. "I've told her that." "I know," Selene said. "Caleb said you handled yourself honestly with Greer. That counts for something." Something shifted in Adelaide's face. A small release of tension, the kind that comes when you've been carrying something and someone finally acknowledges the weight. "Thank you," she said. She looked at the girls. "Good day, Ivy. June." "Good day, Miss Adelaide," June said, with the automatic good manners of a child who had been drilled in them. Ivy nodded. Adelaide moved past them. June watched her go. "Was that hard?" she asked Selene. "Which part? Saying she did something right when she was connected to something bad?" Selene thought about it honestly. "A little," she said, "but it was true. And saying true things that are slightly hard is generally better than the alternative." June turned this over. "Ivy does that," she said. Ivy, half a step ahead of them, said nothing, but her shoulders went back slightly in a way that suggested she had heard and was not going to comment and was also not unpleased. They walked back to the wagon through the cold market day crowd, Silas's hand briefly on Selene's shoulder for one moment as they navigated a narrow gap between stalls. Not meaningful, just steadying, and the girls ahead of them arguing about something minor in the way of siblings who have an ongoing negotiation with each other about the world. Selene carried June's wooden horse in her coat pocket, where it bumped against her hip with every step. She did not have a plan for what came next, specifically. She had the diversion channel in the northwest pasture and the east barn wall, and 3 months of ledger entries, and a letter from Kansas City, and a child's wooden horse in her coat pocket. She had Ivy in the evening reading out loud. She had June's questions, which never stopped. She had Silas and his coffee pot and his particular form of oblique approval. She had a new peg on the wall by the back door. She had the conversation she and Caleb had not finished yet, because you matter. And I'm not going anywhere were beginnings, not conclusions, and they both knew this, and neither of them were in a hurry, which was different from either of them being afraid. Or at least, it was becoming different. Which is how fear actually changes, when it changes, not all at once, but incrementally, so slowly you don't notice until you look back at where you started and the distance surprises you. The market crowd moved around them. The cold was real and specific and present. June reached back without looking and took Selene's hand, for no reason except that she was 8 years old and Selene was there. And then she looked forward again, still talking to Ivy about whatever she'd been talking about. Selene held the child's hand. She held it all the way back to the wagon. She did not calculate how long it would last or build the exit route in her head or remind herself of all the ways this was temporary. She just held June's hand in the cold December air and walked, and the wagon was where they'd left it, and Silas helped the girls up, and they drove back through the snow-edged road toward Thorn Ridge, and the ranch appeared on the horizon the way it always did now. Not as a destination, but as a direction she was already moving in. The suitcase was still in her room. She hadn't opened it in 6 weeks. She was aware, in the way you're aware of things you haven't consciously checked on, that this was significant, that she had stopped, somewhere in the middle of all of it, keeping it ready. She hadn't decided to do that. It had just happened. The wagon turned through the gate and the house was lit against the winter dark. And somewhere inside it, Caleb had come back from his supply delivery and would be at the table or at the property maps or standing at the counter with his coffee. And the girls jumped down before the wagon fully stopped because they never waited. And Silas shook his head at this, as he always did, and Selene climbed down and walked up the porch steps and opened the front door to the warmth inside. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She was not a person who had things. She had not been, for a long time. She had been a person who moved through things, careful not to press too hard against them in case the impression she left was unwelcome. She had kept herself portable, compact, easy to pack. She stepped inside. She closed the door behind her. The suitcase was in her room, closed, and she had stopped checking whether it was still there, and this was the truest thing she knew right now about where she was. Christmas came to Thorn Ridge without announcing itself in advance, which was how most things came there. Silas brought in a pine tree on the 22nd that was slightly too large for the front room, which he seemed to regard as a success. The girls decorated it with 15 years of accumulated ornaments and argued about placement while Silas sat in his chair pretending not to care. Selene made the food. Caleb cut more wood than they needed, which was the thing he did when he had feelings he was working through. She noticed without commenting because she had her own version of the same thing. Christmas Eve was quiet in the way that good evenings are quiet. Not empty, just settled. The 5 of them at the table after supper, the tree throwing soft light in the corner, Ivy reading aloud from her new book while Caleb listened with the complete attention he gave things that mattered to him. Selene sat with her hands around her coffee and let herself feel it without pulling back from it. This table, this light, these people. She looked away before it became something she had to immediately do something about. After the girls went to bed, Silas excused himself with the tact of a man who has read a room correctly, and Selene was washing the dishes and Caleb was at the table with the ledger he'd brought out as cover and hadn't opened. "The ledger is upside down," she said. A pause, the sound of him turning it over. "I knew that." She dried her hands and turned around. He was looking at her in the way he had of looking at things he was trying to understand rather than confirm. Selene, he said. He had the slightly pained expression of someone who had decided to say something difficult and was finding the route harder than the destination. I want to be clearer than I was before about what I said, that you matter. She waited. You came here with the suitcase, and 7 weeks later you knew my horses better than my own hands do. You figured out what Ivy needs before she says it. You reorganize things when something's wrong because that's how you think. And I figured that out too. He looked at the table and then back at her. I don't want you here because the girls need you. I want you here because I want you here, on my own account. The kitchen was still. She walked to the table and sat across from him. Caleb, I've been told I was wanted before and it turned out to mean something smaller than it sounded. I'm going to need you to be patient with me when I forget this isn't that. I know, he said, and I need you to say the thing again sometimes, even when you'd rather just fix a fence about it. Something moved through his face, almost the full smile, the real one. I can do that? Then yes, she said. It's enough. They sat at the table a while longer. Neither of them needed anything larger than what had just been said. Some things are enough when they're said plainly by the right people, and the room knows it, and there is nothing more required. She went to her room. She looked at the suitcase in the corner. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she'd move it to the top shelf of the wardrobe, where things go when you don't need them regularly. Not throw it away. You don't throw away the thing that carried you through 7 years. But you put it somewhere that means stored rather than ready. She closed her eyes. The thing about Lenora Pike, which settled itself in January without drama, was that she had made one final calculation and gotten it wrong. Greer's County filing sat in an office and did nothing visible until it became the entire context through which everything related to Lenora Pike was understood. Her social position, which she'd believed was sufficient ballast against a circumstantial record, turned out not to be. Not after the fire. Not after the people of Dust Creek had spent 3 months carrying her suggestions about Selene Mercer and then been forced to hold those suggestions against the image of a woman coming out of a burning barn with smoke on her coat and a child's pony behind her. People can hold 2 contradictory ideas about a person for a long time, not indefinitely. Eventually something resolves the contradiction, and the resolution carries the full weight of how long it was delayed. By February, Lenora was selling the south quarter of her land. Adelaide, Silas reported one morning over coffee, was engaged to a schoolteacher in Wharton County and planned to marry in March. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said things that were both significant and settled. Good for her, Selene said, and meant it. She had no appetite for contempt toward Lenora Pike. The woman had wanted things, had convinced herself that wanting them badly enough made any method reasonable, and was now living with the ordinary consequences of that. That was sufficient. Selene had spent enough energy on that particular chapter of her time in Dust Creek, and she was done spending it. Greer came by the ranch one afternoon in February, sat with Silas over coffee, and as he was leaving said to Selene without preamble, "The county filing is complete. No further action required from Thorn Ridge. The parties involved have been spoken to." He paused at the door. "You did right, going back in for that pony. That counted." He left. She stood holding a coffee mug she'd forgotten she was holding. It was over. Not with a confrontation or a public reckoning, just quietly, through the weight of consequences finding their natural level, until there was nothing left to sustain the conflict. She went outside to find Caleb. He was at the south fence line, fixing a post that had never needed fixing, because he'd seen Greer's horse in the yard all morning and had been processing the visit with his hands. She walked out and told him what Greer had said, short and complete. He was quiet. He set the tool down. "I want to say something," he said. "All right." He turned to face her with the full attention he gave things that mattered. "I brought you home from that station because the girls needed someone, and you were there. That's the honest version of how it started." He met her eyes. "But that's not why you stayed. And it's not why I'm asking you to stay now. I want you to know I know the difference." She looked at him, the cold and the flat winter sky and the fence line running both directions across the property. "Caleb," she said, "I know." "I'm not done," he said. She waited. "I don't have language yet for exactly what I'm asking, but I'm asking you to stay while I figure it out, if you can stand that." She thought about the suitcase on the top shelf, about June's hands on the edges of it, bracing, about her own voice saying, "I promise," without any hesitation at all. "I can stand it," she said. The real smile came. Brief, but complete. She filed it in the account she'd been keeping since October, which at this point was substantial. She turned and walked back toward the house. The day the last open question closed came 3 days later, without warning, the way the most important moments usually do. She was coming in from the barn when she heard the sound from her room, the specific silence of 2 children who have frozen mid-activity upon hearing footsteps. She came to the doorway. June was on the floor with the suitcase open in front of her. Ivy stood beside her with the expression of someone who had not technically endorsed this and wanted the record to reflect that. June looked up. Her face had the quality of someone in the middle of a feeling too large to manage immediately. "I wasn't going through your things," she said. I found it, and it was closed, and I thought—" Her voice went small in a way Selene had never heard from her. "I thought you were packing." The sentence sat in the room. Selene looked at the child on the floor. June, who asked questions adults had stopped knowing how to ask. Who held your hand on cold streets for no reason except that you were there. Who had been watching Selene since the night in the station with those dark, entirely serious eyes. Sitting on the floor with both hands on a suitcase, bracing for something she'd been afraid of since April when Ruth left. "June," Selene said quietly, "I moved that suitcase to the corner last week. I'm going to put it on the top shelf of the wardrobe tomorrow. I just hadn't gotten there yet." June stared at her. "I'm not packing," Selene said. "I'm not leaving." The silence had texture, the held breath texture of a child deciding whether to believe something she wants very badly to be true. "Promise?" June said. Not a sophisticated question, just the bare, plain version of every question Selene had been asking herself for 4 months, stripped of all the protective language adults build around the same fear. She crouched down to June's level. "Yes," she said, "I promise." June looked at her one moment longer. Then she closed the suitcase with both hands, stood up, and said in her normal voice, "Ivy said dinner is going to be late because the potatoes are being difficult." "Potatoes aren't difficult," Ivy said from the doorway. "The timing is presenting a challenge." "That's the same thing." "It is not the same thing." "Give me 10 minutes, Selene said. "I'll sort the potatoes." She moved the suitcase to the top shelf that night, standing on a chair to reach. She pushed it back far enough that it wasn't visible from the doorway, and stood there a moment with her hand on the wardrobe top. It was a good suitcase. It had carried everything she owned through 7 years and 5 cities and a dozen towns and 1 train station in the middle of nowhere on a Tuesday night in October. She was not sentimental about objects, but she allowed herself 1 moment of acknowledgement before she got down and went to bed. The days that followed were ordinary in the way she was still learning to be inside without examining too closely. Not perfect. The soup one evening was oversalted. February was relentlessly cold. The girls argued with the consistency of people who have made it a practice, and Caleb was still better at saying things with fence posts than with words, though he was visibly working on this. What she had was what she had. It was a working ranch in a small frontier town where the gossip had shifted from her to other things, and the woman who'd tried to burn it down was selling land, and the east barn wall was stronger than before, and the northwest pasture was draining clean after 3 bad seasons, and the horses were settled in their stalls, and the ledger was balanced. What she had was a peg by the back door that was hers now, that nobody used anymore because it was understood to belong to her without any conversation about it. What she had was Silas refilling her coffee every morning before she asked, and Ivy reading aloud in the evenings, and June's hand in hers on cold streets for no reason, and Caleb at the fence line turning to face her with both hands off the rail, giving her his full attention the way he gave it to things that mattered. The last evening of February, she stood at the kitchen window after supper, watching the dark outside, the snow and the barn wall, and the smoke from the bunkhouse chimney going sideways in the wind. She had arrived here with nothing. She had arrived here, more precisely, with the specific nothing of a person who has been moving so long that they've stopped believing stopping is possible. That kind of nothing is not neutral. It shapes everything, the way you hold yourself, the way you hold back, the way you calculate exits in rooms you've only just walked into. She had been living inside that nothing for 7 years, managing it, maintaining it, making it functional. She had put it down somewhere between October and now. She couldn't tell you the exact date. That's not how it works. You don't wake up one morning cured of the habits that kept you alive. You just notice eventually that you stopped checking whether the door is still open because you stopped needing to know. Caleb came up beside her at the window. He didn't say anything. He looked at the same dark yard she was looking at, and they stood there in the ordinary way of people who have gotten used to standing in the same place. "You all right?" he said. She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He went back to the table. She stood at the window one moment longer, and then she turned around into the warmth and the light and the sound of the house in the evening. Ivy's book, June's voice, Silas's chair, the clock on the shelf, and she was inside it, all the way inside it, not standing at the edge of it waiting to be asked to leave. She had spent a long time waiting for a door to close. It stayed open. That's the whole story. Not the version with a clean moral stamped on the bottom, not the one where everything broken gets fixed and everyone becomes their best self. Just a woman who had been moving for 7 years and stopped. Who was afraid and stayed anyway. Who kept her promises in small rooms to small people and found out that small promises, kept, are the architecture of everything that lasts. The house held around her. She let it.